This is Karen with NewClevelandRadio.net, and it is time for Lessons Learned. And Lessons Learned is a new podcast that we've put together, and it's about all the things that we've sort of have been through in our lives that we want to share with others. And I chose to ask Sherry to join us today, not as a therapist, but as a friend, as a person who has experienced life and a little differently than I have. And one of the things that sort of has impressed me, Sherry, when I read some of the posts that you put out on Facebook is um, your parents both lived in concentration camps and they came to the United.
Oh, they didn't. I don't think
Oh,
we call it lived in
okay.
concentration camps, but yes,
But
yeah.
they're
And then here in the U.S. after the war.
they did meet here in the
My
US.
mom
Okay.
was very young. She was just 13 or 14. And initially, she was captured with a friend of hers. No, first she was captured not with a friend, and it was like a long line. And my mother actually ran away the first time she was captured
I
by
love
the
that.
Nazis. And then the second time she was captured, she was with her best friend Esther. So she figured, I'm not even going to try. At least I'm with my friend, and she wound up rescuing her friend, saving her life. Because at one point, her friend was very ill. And my mother actually ran into the woods and kind of came across, I mean, obviously within the camp.
Sure. Yeah.
She was at a work camp, not like a concentration camp. The
Okay.
difference is that if she was at somewhere like Auschwitz or Dachau, where my father was, I don't think she would not have made it. And she kind of came across some Nazis like around a campfire, and she went and stole a potato for Esther. And then she realized a piece of her dress had snagged on something, and she went back and got the piece of dress. I mean that was my mother at like 13, at 14 years old.
And I want everybody to know that this is Shay, and Shay has a big part in your life too. So,
Yeah.
but I think one of
Shay's
the
been here through this tough year. Yeah.
yes, it's such a loving baby. Um, so one of the things I think that has impressed me is that you come from a family of survivors. And um, when you write about some of the things that you've been through, there's always this positive glow. So, how did your parents instill that in you? I mean, it had to have been rough what they went through.
I mean, you can't even describe what they went through. And I just want to mention a little bit of my father.
Sure.
Well, first with my mother, initially, she had her father died when she was 3 of a heart attack. My mom was the youngest. And um, everybody found out later just what happened to their families. And my mother found out later her sisters and her mother died at Auschwitz. And she wound up, coming to the U.S. She was going to go to Palestine originally with her friend Esther, but her brothers, when they found her, said, "We're not letting you go with that. We're not separating again." And so she came to New York with them. My father was the oldest of four. He was the only boy. He was from Lodz. My parents were at different towns in Poland. And my father, by the time he was captured, his family was captured. It was in 1944. They knew what was going on by then. And they were taken to Auschwitz by cattle car, his parents and his siblings, and they knew about Mengele and the right line, left line. And so my father watched his parents and little sister be, Mengele went, here, and he watched that. And his father turned around and looked at him, turned around and looked at him, turned around and looked at him until they faded from view. And then my father actually was transferred to Dachau, and he was there until liberation. And my mother, I was raised on hearing her stories. My father didn't really start telling me. I never knew the story that I just told you until my father testified at a war trial. invited to testify at a war trial for this one particular Nazi whose nickname was the Boxer because he was so vicious. And the Boxer had quotas of how many Jews you take away at a specific time to the camps. And the Boxer obviously was somebody who, they were all vicious. You wouldn't be doing
Right.
that unless you had no conception of Jews as human beings. And so I went with my father when he testified. And it was a situation where this man, I don't remember his name anymore, the Boxer had already served time in Russia for crimes he'd committed there. But the Boxer he was not in jail. He and his wife would come to court when there was somebody who was giving testimony. And, as my father said to me later, as I was saying, you didn't really say anything that damning. And he said it was because, at the time, it wasn't like he was running up to say, I want to look at you and really know your face so I can testify against you in 40 years. And my father, there was a German lawyer for him, and there was a judge, and there was something like 9 lawyers for
Oh my gosh.
and it was very scary, and my father had always wanted me to write about this, and I wanted to write about it. In fact, I had a little tape recorder with me, and then the judge actually said, and you're not, you're not going to do anything with this or write. And so my father said, no, 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 we were just cowed. And I sort of like, it was January and bitter cold. And I sort of like kind of was hiding the tape recorder in my warm down coat. So I just sort of hid it even more. I just, wound up then just taking notes. And they said, why are you taking notes? And I said, just as a daughter for her father. Because I did write about this later. And and really the reason why, to get back to the question you asked me, that my family, all my relatives are survivors. I never had a grandparent. My father's and 2 sisters survived. One went to Australia with the man she married, and my father came to New York with his 2 sisters. And my parents met when they were in the Catskills, which is sort of like in the mountains where they
Right.
have this,
Beautiful.
like
Yep.
the Concord maybe might be one that people know about. And my father was a waiter, a busboy, and my mother was a chambermaid, and that's where they met. And basically, they all came here after the war with no money, not knowing English, just having gone through all this horror and triumph. And all they wanted to do was raise families and just have that and do that and make a living and a life. So, and my father wound up starting a business where he went door to door selling clothes and household goods, and he had customers for decades and decades and decades, and that's who I come from. And I come from people who just obviously totally understood the value of life and family and connection. And I later became an interviewer for Steven Spielberg's Survivors of the Shoah. I mean, when Steven Spielberg was making the film Shoah, Jews would come up to him and tell their story, and
Right.
that's what they do. So he started this organization, Survivors of the Shoah, which videotaped memories of survivors. So I became an interviewer for that. And I mean, it was a volunteer thing pretty much. And over a 2-year period, I interviewed probably around 70 survivors in their home.
Wow.
It was myself. I would call the survivor beforehand and talk to them so they'd understand that I knew, I got it. I was somebody they could trust. And there was a videographer, and it was basically us and the survivor. And for 2 hours, I would just be asking questions, and my parents gave their testimony too. And at the end of the testimony, then family members would come on camera, and also artifacts, whatever photos you had or any documentation to show that this had happened. And it was, I actually did the first two interviews, the first interview with Steven Spielberg about Shoah, and then I did one with him 25 years later. They were both for USA Weekend to commemorate, you know, Shoah. And Shoah now, it's amazing their headquarters is in LA. And when I was there a few years ago for a book tour, actually, I went to the show office and they just showed me all the technology that they're doing. It's amazing now. I mean, they do like, um, what's it called? Not hieroglyphics. I can't really say chemo brain anymore. It's been
Yep.
a while, but basically this technology where it's sort of like it looks like you are with the survivor. I know 60
Unbelievable.
Minutes
Yep.
did a piece about this, and because this is for students and everybody can like just sort of ask a question, and the everything is cross-referenced and whatnot, and all the testimonies and the kinds of questions and where the survivors are from. So you ask a question and it's like the survivor is personally answering you. And it's an amazing thing. And now this technology, and this is being used to get the testimony not just from survivors of the Holocaust, but all kinds of genocides and
Sure.
atrocities. And this is about we have to bear witness and understand. So, and to really understand what humanity is, what hate does, what surviving is about. It was really a choice. In a lot of cases, a lot of the survivors who I interviewed for the Shoah Project, there were times when they really made choices, and you didn't know what your choice would lead
Sure.
to in a lot of
Exactly.
cases. But there were also, I mean, you could decide I'm just gonna run on the electrified fence and perish that way. I mean, you have to really want to live. I took testimony from people there was this one woman, she had jumped off in the middle of winter, she jumped off a cattle car, into just snow and cold in the middle of who knows where you were. So there really is that spirit. And I also found that the people who were not just totally consumed by anger and vengeance were the best off because you had the capacity and the space for more and to say, what can this teach me and where do I want to be? In fact, I'm kind of going through some of that process again for myself after, having breast cancer, and I'm doing great, earlier this year. But, and, as the pandemic was starting, I had surgery and then I had chemo and then I had radiation. And it really does make you say, why me? Why did I make it? Why am I here when all these people don't? And I think you have to have that what contribution can I make? What am I here for? And I know a lot of why I've gotten through what I've gone through this year is because I look to lessons from all my family, but especially my mother, who was just unbelievable, so tough. She once again came to the fore when I was hit by a car, and the car basically like rolled over my ankle. And ours, as the doctors put it, an inch from amputation. And I didn't want to let my mother know at first because I knew everything she'd been through and I just didn't want to put this on her. My mother is just this tiny little Clairol blonde whirlwind. So I finally, I remember the intern at the hospital, which was a horrible hospital, was saying to me, Sherry, you don't want to stay here. You really will lose your leg. This is not a good place. You need to go somewhere better. And he finally persuaded me, and I did contact my mother, who like kind of whipped out her charge card, hired an ambulance, and got me to a better place. And we wound up with the head of orthopedic surgery, who saved my ankle with this technology that he had maybe not invented, but just perfected, brought to the U.S. And so it's that kind of example that I had from my mother that spurs you to get through stuff and do what you can. And, in my case also, I always had a real feeling of I must give back, because my first career was as a journalist and I still write. And then I did a mid-career switch to becoming a psychotherapist, because it's just really important. I am here because of my choices that and strength, the courage that my mother made. And so I feel like I have to justify that by being there for other people. So, my mother is probably like my guiding spirit, I guess, even though she's been gone, since God, 2005 now. Yeah.
And it's interesting because our parents, at least for me, are never really gone. They're not physically here. Um, but all that your parents went through, that you learned about, that you became connected with, helped develop you into the person that you are today. But there was a fork in the road. You could have gone a different direction if you had chosen to. If you had chosen, I don't want to listen to these things that happened in the past. It's not going to happen today, and gone a different direction, but you didn't because
Well, I mean, I don't know if we can say it's not going to happen today. Um, it does happen
oh, we
in various
absolutely
parts of the world. And frankly, it's the first time once, Trump was elected. I have never not felt safe in this country.
right.
I did. And so I think what that was a lesson: never take it for granted and always fight, because otherwise you are never safe.
And I appreciate that because those of us who didn't have that immediate connection, okay? My grandparents left Russia when the Cossacks were there, okay?
Yeah.
And I've heard stories about that, but nothing to the degree of what we heard about World War II and the concentration camps. Um, and my parents were first generation American. And so I knew that they had friends who had been through World War II, but didn't know the extent of it, except what I learned in history books and saw in the movies or talked to people such as yourself. Um, so I didn't have that same push like you did. It was a different kind of a push. I don't ever want to see that happen to somebody else, but it wasn't deep inside of me. But yet we all have to, as far as I'm concerned, need to have that inside of us because we don't know what can happen in the next minute or two around us. Like you said, 4 years ago, Trump went into the White House, and I agree. I've never felt unsafe under any other administration. I may not have liked other administrations, but I still felt safe. They were there to protect us. The last 4 years, no, have not felt safe at all. Um, and even in the last couple weeks, some of the things that we've seen going on, I haven't felt comfortable.
Absolutely. And, I've done uh, a number of things, not enough and not as much as so many other people, but the things that I have done because of the example set by my parents. Like when I was still a journalist, I mean, well, actually, I might have been in social work school, I think, when I did this one. I mean, I went to Rio and did stories on street children. I went to Ghana and did stories on what are called witches camps, which is like, these villages in towns in Africa, and probably not just Africa, where they're, and it really is about education. Without education, these people live in poverty and such hardship. All they know, and so they're also prone to, they're fearful, so they will believe things that
Sure,
are ridiculous, but they believe. And what they believe there is in witches, in witchcraft. So they would, wind up picking an old woman when that woman's son would die. Then they want somebody, they wanted the house. So they'd say, "You're a witch." and basically stone and drum that woman out of town, so she would out of the village, so she would wind up in what is called like a witches camp, where I mean, just with these where these women wound up being kept, and 80-year-old women are like walking to the well to get water with like heavy buckets, pails on on their head. I mean, these kinds of things still
Happen.
exist everywhere. More recently, I went right before the pandemic and right before I was diagnosed with cancer. Actually, I'm a member of an organization called Sisterhood of Shalom. Oh God, yeah, Sashalom, SOSS.org. I'm sorry. Yeah,
It's okay.
I'm gonna call it chemogram for the next 50 years. It's
Hey,
fine. Sisterhood of Shalom, Shalom. Okay. Anyway, that's an organization of Jewish and Muslim women. And the whole idea is, again, once you get to see the other person as a human being with similarities, and you build that underlay of trust and respect, then you can start dealing with more difficult issues that divide. But until you have that, you're just much more prone to believing everything, and just viewing somebody who comes from a very different background as the other. Um, so there are chapters all over the country, small chapters actually now in Canada, in Europe. And so there's also like an annual conference where everybody meets, and they were doing an annual trip. So this trip that I went on with them was to Tucson, to the border, and so we met with, hey, Shay. Yeah, so, we saw what the situation that was going on there, to a shelter, to, the border at Tucson, to all of these things, and, met with people who were spearheading organizations to help, so this sort of thing, it still goes on. And, I'm not saying this is let everybody in, but the way that um, human beings are treated, it's basically like, catch and release, catch and throw you back, and then kept in these horrific conditions for like weeks and months and whatever on end. So, I mean, I had just come from that trip. Um, and just the last night of it was really the last night of our trip together, because by then there was a real bond. And that's when, not until we had been together for a week, getting to know each other and finding common cause, did we get together in a circle and share our feelings about, where we came from. Like, I was not the only one as a Jew who felt that the Muslim women must hate Jews, and just having that kind of conversation once there was trust. And it was so moving. And these are the things that are necessary, like that's why I just did a Zoom with Next Tribe, which
yes.
is a website, nexttribe.com, for women over 45. And the idea of that, and I was nervous about doing it, was to bring women who are Republican and women who are Democrats, not to agree, but to start viewing the other side as a human being
Right.
with similar goals and values. And that's a hard one, and especially everybody saying, it's kind of early, I don't want to go here. But these are the things that ultimately have to be done. It's that instant villainizing
Absolutely.
that's so harmful. And look at what has happened to our country over these last 4 years. It's just mind boggling and so frightening, because we always have to be careful and keep watch. And those are lessons that I carry here, deeply. And it has to be there. If we look away, that doesn't, that just makes it even more likely that these horrible things will be happening. So my background has made me just so aware of injustices that are done in the name of religion, and as a therapist, as a psychotherapist, I have patients who come from all different walks of life, and that's always been very important and nourishing for me. But that's why part of being a psychotherapist, you have to undergo cultural sensitivity training, obviously, because, you know, um, why should somebody, if the therapist patient bond has to be one of trust, and if you can't have that, you cannot be in treatment with this
Right.
person. So I have to be able to bring my part to the table and do the work myself to see where my prejudices, um, countertransferences, to use a therapy lingo, lie. you know and that's certainly important. And there was certainly after everything that's happened this year with George Floyd and all of that, because I have patients, and and we talked about it, and we talked about how they felt that, I'm white, and I've developed relationships with these people, these patients of mine, so they did trust me. But I would certainly understand it's someone's right and privilege, you know, to say, well, I don't really feel that comfortable with you, or to listen to the
Absolutely.
reasons. It's about listening. When we get so defensive and then offensive and then, all of those things, we're not listening. And so the person is really reluctant to talk to us because what's the point? I'm not going to hear it.
And that's often we see that within families and relationships that we don't listen, we hear to respond. Okay. And that's why I wanted to start this series, because it's time that we start listening, observing, and I don't have to agree, but I certainly don't have to disagree. Okay. Because it's coming from the other person. The same way I want that opportunity when it's my turn to be able to say what I feel, but it's not meaning that we damn the other person. Okay. This is just our experiences. And
We may disagree very strongly with what that other person feels. And that certainly happened
yes,
in the Zoom that I did, you know, with three Democratic women and three Republican women, for sure. There's certainly, and again, I'm not going to get into all of that and
sure.
the what's a fact and what's not a fact and how you believe, your beliefs are often forged in what you expose yourself to. Like I was asking, what news sources do you trust? And just all those things. And if all we do is listen to, like, our Facebook threads are all people who are totally like-minded, and just all of that, if we're not reading or exposing themselves or ourselves to, other ways of thinking, we won't move anywhere.
Absolutely. Well, I certainly appreciate this because I've gotten to know you a little bit better. I'm glad to see you looking perky this morning. I have to tell you, about 10 minutes before we were supposed to go on, I had fallen asleep and I looked at my phone and I said, "Oh my, I got to get up." So it was like, I got to get perky myself, but it's always great sharing with you. And I'm
Thank you
so
for
glad that you're
asking
part
me.
of our podcast family. And I understand you're going to be doing something special here in the next couple weeks when we have your next podcast. So,
Yes, yes. I originally started doing, the podcast as a therapy session, therapy, real therapy with Sherry Amatenstein, where I was doing, an actual therapy session with somebody who was on anonymously, who was not a real patient of mine. Well, not a patient of mine.
yeah.
And they would, agree to come on. And then I would have phone conversation with them prior, an intake, as I do with anybody who's coming to therapy. So I know about them, they would trust me, and if there were certain things they wouldn't want me to bring up, then that was fine. But then we would do an anonymous therapy session, you know.
Right.
And because I think I started doing that because there is still such a stigma in a lot of
Right.
corners about therapy. But I think especially since the pandemic and all these things have started, I've been veering away from that and been focusing more on this psychological piece about different issues that we're facing. Like I did one on pre-election stress, on dealing with COVID trauma, and on couples, and how they're coping. And the next one that I am going to be doing is actually talking to people who are long haul COVID sufferers, because that's really difficult journey, and there's so much that is still unknown in that. So that certainly brings um, a lot of physical as well as psychological issues to the fore. So that's what, and I think that anybody can relate to that. It's not just for people who have unfortunately had, COVID and still have, instead their life is still very changed from it. But all of us can go through something that just changes your life, and all of a sudden your body and your mind are not working the way you want them to or the way you expect them to, and that's very scary.
Yes.
And that's something I think that we all can relate to. So that's what the next therapy is going to be about.
Well, we're looking forward to it. In the meantime, enjoy the rest of your day and
And
give
you
Shay a
enjoy the rest of your day.
thank
They
you.
said,
Bye,
"Okay, guys,
Shay.
have a
He's
good
adorable. Love you guys. Take
day."
care.
Okay, bye.